He was hailed across the breadth of the British Empire as the Conqueror of Canada, the meticulous and unwavering military strategist who, through careful planning and relentless execution, secured a vast North American empire for Great Britain, effectively extinguishing French colonial ambitions on the continent. His name, Lord Jeffery Amherst, was subsequently etched onto the landscapes of the New World. Towns, counties, prestigious colleges, tangible testaments to a legacy forged in the crucible of imperial victory. Yet, beneath this polished veneer of celebrated military triumph, another, far darker and more disturbing narrative persists, a narrative inextricably linked to brutal policies of subjugation, a deep-seated racial prejudice, and one of the most morally repugnant proposals recorded in the annals of colonial warfare, the calculated, deliberate contemplation of using infectious disease, specifically smallpox, as a weapon of extermination against Native American peoples. Lord Jeffery Amherst. Was he truly the brilliant, indispensable architect of British victory in the tumultuous French and Indian War, a disciplined hero of an expanding empire deserving of the accolades showered upon him? Or was he, in fact, a ruthless and callous commander whose significant military successes were irrevocably tainted, perhaps even defined, by the profound cruelty and unyielding contempt he displayed towards the indigenous populations whose lands he conquered? This documentary will endeavor to explore the stark dualities of Amherst's career, his undeniable and strategically vital military achievements that led directly to the fall of New France, alongside an unflinching examination of the deeply controversial, ethically fraught aspects of his command and his policies, particularly those directed towards Native Americans. We seek to understand the complex, often contradictory, and fiercely contested legacy of this pivotal, yet increasingly polarizing, historical figure. Welcome to Old Around the World, where we travel back in time to bring history back to life. Jeffery Amherst was born in 1717 into the comfortable, well-connected world of Kentish gentry, a social standing that provided him with crucial access to the established pathways of military advancement within the rigid hierarchy of 18th-century Britain. He embarked upon his military career at a tender age, securing a commission as an ensign and later distinguishing himself as an aide-de-camp to influential commanders such as General Sir John Ligonier, one of Britain's most respected soldiers. During the far-reaching War of the Austrian Succession, his service on the battlefields of continental Europe, including pivotal engagements like Dettingen in 1743 and Fontenoy in 1745, provided him with invaluable first-hand experience in the structured, conventional warfare of the era. These formative years also allowed him to cultivate essential connections within the intricate network of the British military and political establishment, connections that would later prove instrumental in his rise. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, across the vast and often treacherous Atlantic, the French and Indian War, the North American theater of what would eventually escalate into the global 7 Years' War, was, in its initial stages, proceeding disastrously for Great Britain. Early campaigns were characterized by a litany of humiliating defeats, crippling logistical failures, and a pervasive sense of ineffective, often out-of-touch, leadership. The catastrophic ambush and death of General Edward Braddock near Fort Duquesne in 1755 served as a particularly stark and demoralizing symbol of British military ineptitude in the face of French and Native American guerrilla tactics. By 1757, with colonial morale plummeting and the French seemingly ascendant, Britain was in desperate need of a significant change in fortune, strategy, and command. It was at this critical juncture that William Pitt the Elder, a dynamic and visionary statesman, assumed effective control of Britain's war effort. Pitt, known for his fervent patriotism and his strategic acumen, recognized the paramount importance of securing North America and actively sought out new, more capable commanders to reverse the tide of defeat. Though still relatively junior in rank for the kind of high-stakes command Pitt envisioned, Jeffery Amherst, then a colonel, had, through his service and connections, impressed both Pitt and Ligonier with his perceived diligence. His methodical and detail-oriented approach to military matters, and his apparent unflappable competence. In a bold and somewhat unconventional move, Pitt promoted Amherst to the rank of Major General in 1758 and entrusted him with an immensely critical mission: to lead the formidable expeditionary force tasked with capturing the heavily fortified French naval base and fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Louisbourg was not just a strategic outpost, it was the veritable key to French power in North America, guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Amherst was not a commander known for dashing battlefield heroics in the mold of a Marlborough, nor did he possess the charismatic, inspirational leadership of some of his more flamboyant contemporaries. His reputation, instead, was built upon a foundation of meticulous, almost obsessive, planning, thorough and exhaustive preparation, the imposition of strict discipline upon his troops, and an unwavering, often painstaking, attention to the crucial, if unglamorous, details of logistics and supply. He was perceived by his superiors as cautious, steady, and utterly reliable, qualities deemed desperately necessary after a string of impulsive failures and ill-conceived ventures by previous commanders. While some subordinate officers and colonial allies might have found his reserved demeanor, his occasional inflexibility, or his perceived lack of aggressive zeal frustrating, Amherst's systematic, almost scientific approach to warfare was precisely what William Pitt believed was essential to achieve lasting, decisive victory in the uniquely challenging and unforgiving North American theater. Lord Jeffery Amherst's first major test, and indeed his first significant opportunity to validate Pitt's confidence, arrived in the summer of 1758, with the complex amphibious assault on Louisbourg. This formidable French fortress, with its stone ramparts and commanding position, was a linchpin of French maritime power in the North Atlantic. Amherst meticulously planned every facet of the operation, coordinating a large land army with a powerful Royal Navy fleet under Admiral Edward Boscawen. Despite challenging weather conditions, treacherous landing sites, and determined French resistance from the outset, the British forces, with the notably audacious Brigadier James Wolfe playing a conspicuous and crucial role in securing the initial beachheads, successfully established their presence on Cape Breton Island. Amherst then initiated a classic, methodical European-style siege. His engineers constructed batteries, his artillery pounded the fortress walls, and his lines of circumvallation steadily tightened the noose around the French defenders. After nearly 2 months of relentless bombardment and a gradually encroaching encirclement that cut off all hope of relief, the French governor, Augustin de Bastienry de Drucourt, surrendered Louisbourg on July 26, 1758. It was a hugely significant victory for the British, not only neutralizing a major French naval base but also cracking open the strategic door to French Canada via the St. Lawrence River. This success catapulted Amherst to prominence and solidified his reputation as a capable and effective commander. Following the triumph at Louisbourg, Amherst was appointed commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America in late 1758, a testament to the trust placed in him by Pitt and the Crown. For the pivotal campaign of 1759, a year that would become known as Britain's Annus Mirabilis or Year of Wonders due to a string of global victories, Amherst devised an ambitious, multi-pronged grand strategy aimed at systematically dismantling French power in North America. While the daring James Wolfe would lead the now legendary expedition up the St. Lawrence River to lay siege to the heart of New France, Quebec City, Amherst himself would command a large army moving north from Albany. His objective was to advance via the strategic Lake George and Lake Champlain corridor, capturing the key French forts of Carillon, which the British would rename Ticonderoga, and Fort St. Frederick, Crown Point, with the ultimate, if challenging, goal of advancing on Montreal from the south, thereby completing the encirclement of French Canada. Amherst's advance up the Champlain Valley in the summer of 1759 was entirely characteristic of his command style. He moved with painstaking slowness, but with an equally painstaking deliberation, ensuring his supply lines were impeccably secure, his troops well provisioned, and his siege preparations thorough before committing to any major engagement. Rather than risking costly and potentially disastrous frontal assaults on heavily defended positions like Fort Ticonderoga, where the British under General Abercrombie had suffered a horrific and bloody defeat just 1 year prior, Amherst's strategy relied on overwhelming numbers, superior artillery, and systematic siege preparations. This methodical pressure often compelled the outnumbered and increasingly demoralized French garrisons to destroy their fortifications and retreat northwards rather than face certain capture. Both Ticonderoga, in late July, and Crown Point, shortly thereafter, fell into British hands without the necessity of major, pitched battles, further securing the vital southern approach to Canada and tightening the net around the remaining French forces. While James Wolfe was achieving his posthumous, legendary victory on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City in September 1759, Amherst continued his careful consolidation of gains and preparations for the final push. The concluding act in the military conquest of Canada came in 1760. Amherst orchestrated a meticulously coordinated three-pronged pincer movement designed to converge on Montreal, the last major French stronghold and the acting capital of New France after the fall of Quebec. He personally led one army down the St. Lawrence River from Lake Ontario, successfully navigating treacherous rapids and capturing French outposts along the way. Simultaneously, forces under General James Murray advanced westward from the captured city of Quebec, while another column under Colonel William Haviland moved north from the now-secured Lake Champlain. Surrounded on all sides, completely cut off from supplies or reinforcements from a France increasingly crippled by the British naval blockade, and facing vastly superior British numbers, the French governor, Pierre de Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavagnol, saw no viable alternative but to surrender. On September 8, 1760, he signed the Articles of Capitulation, surrendering Montreal, and with it, effectively all of New France, to Great Britain. Lord Jeffery Amherst had achieved what many had thought impossible only a few years prior, the complete military defeat and dismantling of the French colonial empire in North America. From a purely military and strategic perspective, Amherst's achievements during the French and Indian War were monumental and undeniable. His exceptional emphasis on the often neglected criticalities of logistics and supply in a vast and challenging wilderness, his remarkable ability to coordinate highly complex, multi-front operations across immense distances, and his disciplined, systematic, and ultimately successful approach to siege warfare were all instrumental in securing total victory for Great Britain. He was, in many respects, the master organizer, the cool-headed architect who patiently constructed the intricate framework for British triumph in a theater of war that had confounded many of his predecessors. With the fall of New France and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Great Britain found itself in control of an immense, almost unimaginably vast new territory, stretching from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. This new domain was inhabited by numerous powerful and diverse Native American nations who had, for generations, skillfully navigated the complex political and economic landscape created by the presence of rival European empires. Many of these tribes had been allied with the French, not necessarily out of an intrinsic loyalty to the French crown, but often because French colonial policy, with its primary emphasis on the fur trade and a network of trading posts rather than large-scale agricultural settlement, was generally perceived as less immediately threatening to their lands, their sovereignty, and their traditional ways of life than the relentless westward push of the land-hungry British colonists. The daunting task of managing these new relationships, of integrating these diverse indigenous peoples into a now British-dominated North America, fell squarely to Lord Jeffery Amherst, in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief. His approach to this complex challenge, however, marked a radical and ultimately disastrous departure from established British policies, particularly those long advocated and successfully implemented by figures like Sir William Johnson, the highly respected Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern Colonies. Johnson, through years of experience and personal relationships, understood the intricate protocols of Native American diplomacy, the critical importance of formal councils, the symbolic weight of gift exchange, and the necessity of treating Native leaders with a degree of respect as representatives of sovereign, if unequal, nations. Amherst, by stark contrast, viewed Native Americans with unconcealed disdain, suspicion, and a profound lack of understanding. His extensive personal correspondence is replete with deeply derogatory terms, frequently referring to them as savages, an execrable race, and vermin to be extirpated. He saw them not as independent peoples with legitimate rights and grievances, or even as potential allies to be negotiated with, but as conquered subjects who should unquestionably submit to absolute British authority or face the consequences. This deeply ingrained contempt translated directly and devastatingly into official policy. One of Amherst's most significant, ill-advised, and immediately impactful decisions was to drastically curtail, and in many instances, entirely cease the long-standing and culturally vital practice of providing gifts to Native American tribes. For decades, these periodic distributions of European goods, gunpowder, lead for ammunition, tools such as knives and hatchets, iron kettles, woolen blankets, and cloth, had been an absolutely integral part of the diplomatic, economic, and social relationship between Europeans and native nations. From the native perspective, these were not handouts or charity, nor were they tribute in a European sense. Instead, they were seen as tangible symbols of alliance and friendship, a form of rent or acknowledgement for the use of their lands, a necessary lubricant for trade, a recognition of their status as important players in the regional balance of power, and, crucially, as essential supplies for their subsistence, hunting, and survival in a world increasingly impacted by European presence. Amherst, however, viewing this established custom through a lens of military parsimony and imperial arrogance, dismissed it as mere bribery and an entirely unnecessary expense now that the French military threat, and thus the need to curry native favor, had been effectively eliminated. He ordered it stopped or so severely reduced as to be insulting. He also imposed strict and crippling restrictions on the trade of gunpowder and lead to the native tribes, ostensibly fearing that such materials would be hoarded and eventually used against British forces. This policy not only severely hampered the natives' ability to hunt for food, thereby threatening their very sustenance and economic well-being, but was also widely interpreted as a clear sign of profound British distrust and a deliberate, calculated attempt to disarm and weaken them, leaving them vulnerable. Amherst's directives to his officers up and down the frontier were unequivocal: treat the Native Americans with unwavering firmness, demand their complete submission, offer little or nothing in return for their cooperation, and punish any sign of resistance harshly. The nuanced, often patient, diplomacy that had characterized much of the French interaction with native peoples, and even the more enlightened aspects of earlier British policy under superintendents like Johnson, was abruptly replaced by an approach rooted in military dominance, cost-cutting, and overt racial prejudice. The predictable consequences of these abrupt, culturally insensitive, and economically devastating policy changes were almost immediate. Across the vast expanse of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region, a wave of widespread resentment, deep-seated fear, and simmering anger began to boil among the diverse Native American tribes. They felt profoundly betrayed, systematically disrespected, and increasingly threatened by British arrogance and the seemingly unstoppable tide of colonial settlers encroaching upon their ancestral lands. Amherst's policies, born of prejudice, a fundamental misunderstanding of native cultures and expectations, and a short-sighted focus on fiscal austerity, were directly and demonstrably fueling the very discontent, instability, and ultimately violent resistance that he ostensibly sought to prevent. A ferocious storm was gathering on the western frontier, and Lord Jeffery Amherst himself had, unwittingly or not, provided much of the tinder and fanned the flames. The simmering discontent, fueled by Amherst's policies and a growing sense of desperation, ignited into open, widespread warfare in the spring of 1763. Inspired by the charismatic and influential Ottawa war chief Pontiac, and galvanized by a powerful spiritual call for pan-tribal unity and resistance to European encroachment from the Delaware prophet Neolin, a formidable confederation of Native American tribes launched a series of meticulously coordinated surprise attacks against British forts and frontier settlements. These assaults stretched across a vast territory, from the Great Lakes down through the Ohio Valley to the borders of Pennsylvania and Virginia. This conflict, which raged for several years, became known as Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War. In its initial stages, the uprising was remarkably successful. Several key British forts, including strategic outposts like Michilimackinac, Presque Isle, Fort Sandusky, and Fort St. Joseph, were quickly overrun, their garrisons often overwhelmed and massacred. The major strongholds of Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt found themselves under prolonged, desperate, and very nearly successful siege. Lord Jeffery Amherst, stationed in his distant headquarters in New York, reacted to the news of the rebellion not with a considered strategic reassessment of his failed Indian policies, but with unbridled rage and an iron determination to crush the uprising with overwhelming and utterly merciless force. He dismissed any notion of negotiation, compromise, or addressing the legitimate grievances that had fueled the conflict. His correspondence from this period reveals a commander consumed by a desire for vengeance and a belief in the efficacy of total war against those he deemed savages. His orders to his subordinates were chillingly clear and devoid of any semblance of restraint. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. He explicitly advocated for the killing of all native prisoners of war and even grotesquely suggested that his troops to send the Spanish dogs to hunt them down. It is within this context of extreme animosity, dehumanizing rhetoric, and a stated desire for extermination that one of the most infamous and morally repugnant episodes associated with Amherst's command occurred. In the summer of 1763, during the protracted and desperate siege of Fort Pitt, formerly Fort Duquesne. The historical record reveals a deeply disturbing exchange of letters concerning the deliberate use of smallpox as a biological weapon. On June 24, Captain Simeon Acquire, the Swiss mercenary commander at Fort Pitt, noted in his official journal that 2 Delaware chiefs who had come to the fort for a parley were given specific items from the fort's smallpox hospital. Out of our regard to them, we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect. Days earlier, William Trent, a local trader and militia captain present at Fort Pitt, recorded in his own journal that when Delaware representatives met with fort officers, we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect. This local initiative to weaponize disease seemingly aligned perfectly with, or was perhaps even encouraged by, the thinking at the highest levels of British command. Colonel Henry Bouquet, one of Amherst's most trusted field commanders, discussed the dire situation at Fort Pitt and the idea of infecting the besieging Indians with his superior. Amherst replied to Bouquet in a letter dated July 7, 1763, with an infamous suggestion: could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must, on this occasion, use every stratagem in our power to reduce them. Bouquet, clearly understanding his commander's intent, responded affirmatively on July 13. I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall in their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself. Amherst unequivocally approved this plan, writing back to Bouquet on July 16. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. While modern germ theory was not understood in the 18th century, the highly contagious and often devastatingly lethal nature of smallpox was well known and widely feared. The disease had already had a catastrophic impact on Native American populations throughout the Americas, who lacked any prior exposure and thus any acquired immunity. Historians continue to debate the precise direct epidemiological impact of this specific attempt at Fort Pitt, whether these particular contaminated blankets caused a widespread, immediate outbreak among the Delaware and Shawnee warriors besieging the fort at that precise moment is difficult to definitively prove from the available records. However, the explicit intent expressed in these damning letters by Lord Jeffery Amherst and his subordinate officers is undeniable, unambiguous, and utterly horrifying. It reveals a deliberate consideration, endorsement, and encouragement of using disease as a weapon of war, a form of primitive biological warfare aimed at the extermination of their Native American enemies. This correspondence raises profound and deeply uncomfortable ethical questions about the conduct of warfare, the responsibilities of military command, and the very definition of war crimes, even when judged by the often brutal standards of the 18th century. It reveals a dark, deeply troubling undercurrent to the celebrated British victory, a chilling willingness on the part of its highest military commander in North America to contemplate, if not always successfully implement, methods of almost genocidal brutality in the pursuit of imperial control and retribution. As Pontiac's rebellion raged on, proving far more resilient, widespread, and costly to suppress than he had initially anticipated, and with criticism mounting in some political quarters in London regarding his uncompromising handling of native affairs and the immense, ongoing expenses of the conflict. Lord Jeffery Amherst was recalled from his command in North America in late 1763. Officially, his recall was framed as a return for other duties and consultations with the government, but it is widely believed by historians that dissatisfaction with his draconian and ultimately counterproductive Indian policies, and the sheer cost of his methods, played a significant role in the decision. Back in Great Britain, Amherst's career, however, did not appear to suffer unduly or immediately from the controversies that had marked the end of his North American tenure. He was, after all, widely perceived and celebrated by the British public and establishment as the Conqueror of Canada, a national hero. He continued to hold influential positions and receive further honors, eventually becoming a baron, being appointed governor of Virginia, though he never actually traveled there to assume the duties, serving as Lieutenant General of the Ordnance, and ultimately achieving the highest rank in the British Army, Field Marshal. During the subsequent American Revolution, he served as a key military advisor to King George III, generally advocating for a harsh, decisive, and uncompromising approach to crushing the colonial rebellion. Though he famously declined the overall command of British forces in America, perhaps wary of becoming entangled in another protracted, difficult, and potentially unwinnable North American conflict. For much of the intervening history, Lord Jeffery Amherst was predominantly remembered and celebrated, particularly within Britain and parts of English-speaking Canada, as the brilliant military hero who decisively secured North America for the British Empire. His name was immortalized, and his victories commemorated, in numerous towns, counties, streets, and even prestigious educational institutions like Amherst College in Massachusetts. This was the enduring image of the architect of victory. However, in more recent decades, as historical scholarship has paid greater and more critical attention to indigenous perspectives, the often brutal realities of colonial expansion, and the ethical dimensions of warfare, the more controversial and troubling aspects of Amherst's career have come under intense and widespread scrutiny. The architect of controversy has increasingly emerged from the historical shadows, forcing a profound and often uncomfortable reevaluation of his once almost universally lauded legacy. Historians today grapple with this inherent duality, this stark contradiction. How do we reconcile his undeniable organizational skills, his strategic successes in the complex campaigns of the French and Indian War, with his well-documented, virulent prejudice against Native Americans, and his explicit endorsement of what many contemporary observers and modern scholars would unhesitatingly label as genocidal tactics? Can the military achievements, however significant in the context of 18th-century imperial rivalry, be truly separated from the profound ethical failings and the immense human suffering caused by his policies towards indigenous peoples? This ongoing re-examination is part of a broader, necessary, and often painful effort to understand the full complexities and the frequently uncomfortable truths of our colonial past, moving beyond simplistic, heroic narratives of empire builders and villains to a more nuanced, critical, and complete appreciation of historical figures within their multifaceted, often deeply contradictory, historical contexts. Lord Jeffery Amherst. His name echoes still through the annals of 18th-century warfare, inextricably linked with Great Britain's triumphant and continent-altering conquest of New France. As a military organizer, his methodical and meticulous planning, coupled with his unwavering logistical acumen, were undeniably instrumental in dismantling French colonial power in North America, thereby paving the way for undisputed British imperial dominance on the continent. In this significant respect, he was, without question, a key and highly effective architect of a momentous victory, one that profoundly reshaped global power dynamics and the future course of American history. Yet, this formidable legacy of military success is profoundly, and perhaps irrevocably, shadowed by the darker, more disturbing aspects of his command. His deeply ingrained, openly expressed prejudice against Native American peoples, his deliberate implementation of harsh and often cruel policies that systematically disregarded their fundamental rights, their cultural dignity, and their very survival, and, most chillingly, his horrifying endorsement of using the scourge of smallpox as a deliberate weapon of war, cast an indelible and deeply problematic stain upon his historical record. These actions, and the dehumanizing attitudes that clearly underpin them, reveal a ruthless, almost sociopathic pragmatism and an appalling contempt for indigenous lives that are impossible to ignore, excuse, or minimize when assessing the totality of his impact on the North American continent and its peoples. And so, the central, complex question of our inquiry remains, resonating with contemporary debates about how we remember and memorialize controversial historical figures. How do we, centuries later, with the benefit of hindsight and evolving ethical sensibilities, remember and evaluate a figure as deeply paradoxical as Lord Jeffery Amherst? Can his strategic brilliance and his undeniable contribution to the vast expansion of the British Empire be lauded independently of, or perhaps even be seen to outweigh, the profound ethical failings, the documented cruelty, and the immense human suffering caused by his policies and actions towards Native Americans? Or are these facets of his career inextricably, fatally linked, demanding a more holistic, more critical, and ultimately more damning judgment? The ongoing re-examination of historical figures like Amherst is not, as some might contend, an attempt to erase history, nor is it about imposing modern sensibilities anachronistically onto the past. Rather, it is an essential, if often uncomfortable, effort to understand history more fully, more honestly, and more inclusively, to acknowledge all its manifold complexities, its inspiring triumphs, and its deeply regrettable tragedies. It forces us to confront the often morally ambiguous and ethically challenging realities of empire building, of warfare, and of the devastating encounters between different cultures, particularly when those encounters occur under conditions of profound and often violently imposed power imbalance. Lord Jeffery Amherst remains a figure who vividly embodies these difficult and enduring questions, a commander whose story compels us, even today, to consider not just the strategic outcomes and territorial gains of historical events, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the methods employed and the profound, often devastating, human cost involved. Please like, subscribe, share, and comment if you like this. Bye, history lover.